Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to the Effects of Prescribed Fire on Vegetation and Wildlife webinar. I'm Kevin Rowling, Forestry Research Technician with the University of Illinois Extension Forestry, working out of the Dixon Springs Agricultural Center in southernmost Illinois. And that hopefully everyone can hear me. So just to start out, got a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today. And when putting this presentation together, I kind of decided that this could have been divided out into several different presentations. So we're going to do our best. I'm going to speak broadly in some instances, and I'm also going to look at some very specific case studies to kind of highlight certain points. So we're going to start out with a history of fire in North America, talk a little bit about the dominant vegetation types, natural divisions, and some complicating factors that you'll find here in Illinois that have to do with fire. And then sort of divided it out a little bit by ecosystem or habitat type. We're going to go through some of the effects of fire in grasslands, then jump to forests, and briefly talk a little bit about barrens and invasive plants. And then we're going to conclude with a summary of what all we've gone over today. So a brief history of fire. Historically, before European settlement, it's believed that Native Americans started a lot of fires that went across the landscape in North America. Uh, Secondarily, lightning strikes caused some natural wildfires prior to European settlement as well. And then that also occurs after European settlement as well, some lightning strike fires, but not to the significance of fires that we believe were started by Native Americans. Once early European settlers came to North America, there were initial increases in fire on the landscape. This is largely due to clearing of lands for agriculture, burning off slash after harvest of forests, that sort of thing. And these were both intentional and unintentional, and that goes for Native American fires prior to European settlement as well. Accidental fires got started in various ways. One of the kind of early European unintentional fires that is kind of interesting to me are fires that were set nearby train tracks. Um, some of those unintentional fires ended up kind of keeping prairie habitats intact well into the 1900s. So that was kind of an interesting source of fire. Uh, After Europeans had been here a while, there were some very large wildfires in the western US around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And around that time, too, people were thinking about fire and forests in particular, and how those fires were basically consuming the forests and the wood that we would have used for our purposes. And so there began an effort among foresters and those in power to begin suppressing fire pretty much everywhere that it came up. So while we think about it in the West, that also occurred in the East to a great extent as well. And it really culminated with the creation of our favorite Smokey Bear in 1944. Recently celebrated his 75th birthday, if you weren't aware. One of the most successful advertising campaigns in history, one of the most recognizable figures, Smokey the Bear. So that really contributed to the public knowledge of the efforts to suppress fire in wildlands. But then around the 1960s or so, there were a number of studies that came out that looked at the ecological role of fire in various systems and the importance of fire um, to different species. So, following from that, around the 1970s, in terms of wildfire, the Forest Service in particular, in areas where it wasn't as much of a safety issue, they were allowing different areas to burn where it was deemed appropriate. And, um, and that led to these a lot of other studies, even in the eastern U.S., where the ecological role of fire is starting to be more recognized again, and it leads to sort of the advent of prescribed fire programs in natural areas, which brings us pretty close to where we're at today. So, in order to talk about fire and its effects in Illinois in particular, we want to look at what are the different fuels types in terms of wildland fire. Um, and you can see here, this is a map of all the different vegetation types in the US on the right, and then sort of a zoomed in image there on the left. And hopefully you can pick out the kind of outline of Illinois, but it's pretty clear that there are two main vegetation types here in Illinois. So the light green are forested areas, and you can see the majority of forests in Illinois are in southernmost Illinois, and then spread out along the large river systems. You can kind of pick out, here's the Kaskaskia, the Illinois River, and the Mississippi River, and the forests that occurred along there. So these are vegetation, natural vegetation types. That's not exactly what it is today anymore, of course, because of a number of things, mostly agriculture, urbanization, and that sort of thing. But those are sort of the broad categories of vegetation that we're going to be looking at in terms of fire. To complicate things a little more, so we have these 15 natural divisions scattered across the state. If we wanted to, we could probably do a talk on fire in each one of these different natural divisions, but we unfortunately don't have that much time, so we're going to speak to it a little more broadly and get into some details as well. So in addition to the wide variety of different habitat types that you can come across in Illinois, we also have other complicating factors in terms of fire and how it behaves on the landscape today. So if you look at this image here, it shows kind of the natural vegetation on the left as it occurred around 1850 and changes to today, where you can see the vast majority of the state has shifted to agricultural and urban areas, and there is much reduced forest and grassland habitat. And so that leads to fragmentation, and what historically might have been very large landscape fires are now reduced to very small fragmented habitats. And so it's impossible really to duplicate what historic fires were like prior to all this human development. You throw on top of that some invasive species that can either have effects one way or the other. So some invasives might promote additional or more intense burning. Others may actually suppress or almost almost extinguish fires as they approach populations of them. And then climate change, which is also changing the vegetation structure as well in different areas across the state. So really a lot of factors go into how fires burn on the landscape historically and today. But there are a lot of benefits to fire, and that's why we do it. So some of the main reasons to burn is to diversify and maintain certain habitat types. Both prairies and forests can see shifts in dominant plant species when fires are timed at different times or um, at different intervals. It can create mosaics of different habitat types. So, of course, different species are adapted to use or prefer different habitats. There are species-specific adaptations and preferences to burned and unburned areas. Fires can be used when managing invasive plants, and we have a more detailed slide about that later, so I'm not going to get into that too much. In addition to those sort of habitat change goals, it also is good for reducing fuel loads. So we can do a prescribed fire or controlled burn on a day that is less likely to be a very intense fire day. And that way we are reducing the fuel load in an area so that would prevent a more intense fire, perhaps like, for example, during a drought condition. This generally, fires in general can lead to greater biodiversity and can advantage keystone species. So that's kind of the broad view. And with that, we're going to get into a little more details. So first, we're going to look at grasslands in Illinois. So this graphic here illustrates the extent of the tallgrass prairie and how it kind of juts out into northern and central Illinois there, also called the Prairie Peninsula. And of course, Illinois is sometimes referred to as the Prairie State. This was the dominant land use type historically, covered about 22 million acres of Illinois. But today, there's only about 2,300 acres of remnant prairie left. And that's a loss of 99.9%. This ecosystem, of course, is highly fire adapted, and if fire is excluded, it will shift to woody vegetation. So some of the adaptations of vegetation in grasslands to fire and some of the other conditions that you might find, such as grazing animals and drought conditions. The big one for fire is that the buds of a lot of grassland plants are at or below the ground. So basically, when a fire sweeps through, it can take off the top part of that plant, but it has these extensive root systems in a lot of these species. And you can see that in the images here on the right. I found there was an organization online who were growing prairie plants kind of in tubes so that they could show the actual depth and the fibrousness of the root systems of these prairie plants. And it's pretty impressive to check out. So these deep roots are thought to be an adaptation to surviving drought conditions, but I've seen some recent articles that kind of call that into question, that most of these prairie plants are getting their water from sort of the top layer of soil, and are actually getting rare minerals, perhaps, from those deeper roots. But I digress. Um, so in terms of prairie plants, fire timing can shift the dominant species in prairies. So when I talk about timing, in this case, I'm for the most part referring to seasonal occurrence of fire, so spring versus fall or winter, and the phenology of different plants at the time of a fire can have significant impacts for those species as well. So to elaborate a little more, um, uh, generally woody species are at a disadvantage in this ecosystem. And that in large part has to do with their growth points being above ground. So when a fire sweeps through a grassland, uh, those non-woody plants have their growth points below ground. They're easily able to sprout back up their above ground parts. Woody species typically are not that lucky, and they will have to either resprout from the base or come back from seed of some sort. So that's one way that grasses and forbs are able to outcompete woody species um, with the use of fire. So the timing of fire can advantage different species. So as an example here, we have cool season versus warm season grasses. In a lot of cases, cool season grasses, well, let me first say, just generally, cool season grasses are species that are actively growing in the cool seasons. So the spring and the fall are when these plants or these grasses tend to green up, whereas warm season grasses do most of their active growing during the summer, as the name implies. So one strategy in one of the sites I used to manage was to conduct late spring burns in areas that were invaded with smooth brome. This top right image here is a picture of the smooth brome. It's a non-native invasive in grasslands, and it's a cool season grass. So when we were able to, we would conduct late spring burns when smooth brome had already started to green up and was getting ready to shoot up its flower stalk. If we were able to run fire through at that time, it really set back the smooth brome and gave an advantage to some of the warm season grasses and forbs that would uh, actively grow later on in the season. And to elaborate even a little more, these are some results from a study that looked at 8 years of burning annually. So in prairies, generally the consensus is that they would typically burn on a range of 1 to 3 years on average. Of course, that could go longer in different areas, but typically 1 to 3 years. This is a study that looked at 8 years of annual burning, so every year for 8 years. And these are the results that they came across depending on the seasonality of the fires. So they found in spring burns that Indian grass, that's a tall grass, bunch grass, a warm season grass, native, increases in the spring. And then they found with fall and winter burns, they found almost no difference between burns conducted in the fall and winter and the effects on the vegetation. Uh, Either of those seasons, they found increased perennial forb cover. So things like asters, goldenrods, and legumes got a leg up when burns were conducted in the fall and winter. And then some impacts they found no matter what season you burned. Big blue stem was going to increase. Um, and then they also found that species richness increased with time, no matter what season you burned in. And that was, again, over 8 years of annual burning. And these impacts are going to be seen differently depending on the intensity of the fires, um, what the conditions were on the ground. That's why it's important to have sort of these longer term studies. 8 years is a pretty decent amount of time, but even longer would be nice. Some later studies that we're going to look at in this talk, look at the impacts after a single burn. And really, that's difficult to extrapolate any meaningful information from, but we'll get into that a little later. So with that, we're going to jump from vegetation in grasslands to some of the effects of fire on insects and move on to other wildlife. So here's another specific study. This one was another very robust study uh, looking at insects in isolated prairies. So if you think back to our image of Illinois and how fragmented the habitat is and how small some of these remnant prairies are, it can be very important for these small areas in particular to make sure we're getting things right. So this study looked at 151 different species representing 33 families of insects. And what he found was there were species that reacted both positively, neutral, and negatively. So 26% were increasers, 40% were decreasers. But then he went on to say that the decreasers, all of them recovered within 2 years or less. And again, this was a more robust study over the course of 7 years. And, just to um, fill you in a little more about some of the ways that we mitigate for possible negative impacts on insects in particular, is to divide units in to burned and unburned. And so his sites were burned and then allowed to rest for 2 or 3 years. So any species that might have been negatively impacted had a chance to rebound from adjacent unburned areas. And these were conducted in the dormant season, which is when most of our prescribed burns are conducted generally. And in this case, that was March and April in northern Illinois and similar areas. So that can be a factor for insects that are overwintering in the vegetation. And basically, they have no way to escape a fire during the dormant season when that's the case. So to get even more specific, we'll look at a particular insect here, the Silphium gall wasp. So this is a insect species that overwinters as larvae inside the stem of rosinweed, if you're familiar with that plant. This study looked at the height of the galls in the field and then um, looked at the likelihood of the galls being burned up in fires that were of typical size for that area. And basically, what they found was they were not high enough to escape the effects of the fire, and in burned areas, these gall wasps were not going to make it. So basically, the moral of the story is species like this need refugia, areas that are unburned, from which to recolonize. So if you have just a postage stamp prairie and you want to maintain all the insect species that might be occurring there, you want to make sure and divide out those areas into separate units and burn rotationally so that species are able to recolonize from unburned areas. With that, we're going to jump into some vertebrates in grasslands. So birds are mostly affected indirectly by fire in terms of the composition and structure of vegetation. So different species require different habitat structure. A lot of species will use unburned areas with different amounts of duff and litter, either for nesting or for cover. If you've ever seen a burned prairie that's burned pretty completely, there's not many places to hide. So that can be an issue if you've burned an entire site for species to be able to find their habitat needs. Uh, the direct impacts of fire could be nest mortality. So uh, almost all prescribed burns in grasslands are done prior to the time when most species would be nesting, but that's something you'd have to consider for sure. On the other hand, there are a lot of grassland birds that require grassland habitat. So stick thistles, bobolinks, grasshopper sparrow, I have a picture of one of those right there. Henslow sparrows, greater prairie chickens, many different species. And as I mentioned before, if we don't burn, we're not going to have high quality grassland habitat for them. Uh, From there, we're going to get into another group of vertebrates, reptiles and amphibians in grasslands. So in Illinois, the species that I think of first when I think of reptiles and grasslands is the ornate box turtle, the state threatened species. Um, Generally, it's thought that reptiles and amphibians might be more susceptible to direct effects of fire. And we have an example of this here, actually. On the right, you see an ornate box turtle that it was believed was injured by fire. And you can actually see it was caught about a year later, and it is healing its shell over, which I didn't even know was possible until I saw this. And I believe this turtle was caught again even a couple years later, and it had nearly completely healed over that scar. It's unclear whether there will be any long-term effects for this individual, but at least in the short term, it has survived that incident. And it might be that this individual did one of the things that they're known to do. I've seen eastern box turtles sort of burrow themselves into the soil, and that way their carapace is not exposed to that much of the fire as it moves across around them. Um, so there are other mortality events in the literature for reptiles. One of the big ones in grassland, and again, this is a species that's state endangered, the Massasauga. One study found significant mortality after a single burn where a hibernacula was burned over. And then another similar example is the eastern glass lizard. We don't have eastern glass lizards in Illinois, but we have a similar species, the slender glass lizard. It's another one that has been found to have had significant mortality events. And we're going to talk a little bit more about vertebrate mortality events kind of in another slide later on, but with that, I'm going to jump into the next. So moving on to fire effects for mammals in grasslands. This was a study that looked at small mammals. They looked at, if you take a look at this table here, so March 24th, 1981 was the day of the burn, and when they surveyed the site after the burn, they found 57 deceased meadow voles and one masked shrew. But then they were monitoring the changes in these small mammals over time after the burn. So it's really pretty interesting and shows the needs of different small mammals change over time in terms of burned areas. So meadow voles, 60 of them were caught not long after the burn date, and then about, let's see, yeah, 6 months or so after the burn date, they jumped up to 177. So they actually did well following the burn, but then you can see they started to decline with time after the burn. On the other hand, masked shrews kind of did the opposite. So initially they were found in pretty low numbers, but then over time they gradually increased. And the same might be said for the short-tailed shrew, only occurring after is that over a year and a half after the initial burn. On the flip side, you have the 13-line ground squirrel, where this is a species that really likes the open habitat. So initially after the burn, they found a lot of them, and then as the vegetation grew back, they went away. And then these last two species, white-footed mouse and jumping mouse, were kind of flat. They didn't really show a preference too much one way or the other. So I thought that was kind of an interesting study of um, some different small mammals and how they can change over time since a burn. So with that, we're gonna dive into the next largest land cover type in Illinois, forests. So historically, forests covered about 13.8 million acres. Uh, they declined over time after European settlement to about 3 million acres was the low point in 1924. And today, although I should say that was actually around 2005, there was about 4.5 million acres. And we have been on the increase for quite some time. So in terms of forests in Illinois, this is highly variable and can change depending on where you're at in the state or even from site to site within the same region. Um, but speaking broadly, historically, it's thought that most of our forests had a fire return interval of about 1 to 34 years. And one of the biggest issues right now in terms of forest managers is this process of mesification. And a lot of that had to do with fire suppression, but also impacts of fragmentation and other factors as well. But this diagram here on the right kind of shows that process where prior to 1900 you had more open forests, open canopy, trees were spread farther apart. Then you had the fire suppression era where there was a significant increase in shade tolerant mesophytic trees, trees that are able to uh, tolerate more shade, and then also by their different characteristics, they actually kind of reduce the likelihood of fire. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But so this has led to a shift in the dominant species. So from oak hickory, species that prefer more sun, more fire, to and more openness to beech maple dominance. And we'll get into some of that here in a moment. But the importance of oak hickory, I guess I should mention, is several fold. This more open canopy habitat type tends to have a lot more understory vegetation, so greater plant diversity in the understory, which leads to greater insect diversity, which leads to greater bird diversity, and so on. Also, the mast from oak and hickory are more important to different game species. The wood from oak and hickory is generally more valuable than some of the softer hardwoods. So there's a lot of reasons that people are trying to manage to bring back more of this oak hickory dominance to our forests. And one of the things we're doing actually at the Dixon Springs Ag Center is we have a small, what we call demonstration forest. This is a 26-acre site divided into 4 different 6-acre treatment zones. And I left out the control area here, but these are the kind of more dramatic images of what it looks like. From the left, you have our thin only section. You can see all the lush greenery in the understory, kind of the sunlight shining through to reach the forest floor. There are a lot of oak seedlings coming in that area now. In the middle picture is an image of our thin and burn uh, section. Now, this is not representative generally. This was taken while we were doing a lot of the cutting and thinning in this area. And then, and it's gonna change over time, of course. And then finally on the right, we have our burn only section where you can see all these small diameter maples. So those are the things we've mostly cut out of these thin only and thin and burn sections. So these small diameter maples that are basically blocking most of the sunlight from reaching the forest floor. You can see there's very little vegetation in the understory coming in. So that prevents both herbaceous plants from sprouting, but also the oak and hickory, kind of the sun-loving hardwoods that we'd like to see regenerating themselves. So this is just one of the things we're looking at here at the Ag Center, but that's some of the reasoning behind the efforts to restore these more open woodlands to our forests. So some of the adaptations to fire in our forests include things like thicker bark, resprouting from the base of trees and shrubs, curled or flat leaves. So species that are more adapted to fire, such as oak and hickory, if you think about their leaves after they fall, a lot of times they'll curl up, which helps them to dry out faster. And they are a little more, they're less likely to disintegrate. Whereas if you think about maple or beech leaves, uh, those leaves lay flat and tend to disintegrate faster, and so they're less likely to burn. So species like a sugar maple um, with thinner bark, it really doesn't want fire to sweep through an area. So as opposed to those oaks and hickories that are more adapted to that sort of environment. In addition, you have additional recruitment that occurs following fire. This can include things like serotiny. I'm actually not sure if there are any species in Illinois that have that, but serotiny is when you think of some evergreens out west, their cones will only open under the heat of a fire, and basically that allows them to spread their seeds after a fire when it's more likely to have enough sunlight for those seeds to sprout and grow. And then you have a number of plants that benefit from stratification, scarification of seeds that then lead to the germination of plants because this is an adaptation to the openness that is going to be more likely following a fire. So they're more likely to succeed when they germinate following fire for some species. So looking at uh, one study that kind of illustrates some of the things I've just been talking about. This is a study that was done in south central Illinois, actually on a flatwoods area. And this study looked at the effects of 3 burns over the course of 8 years. And prior to the fire, the researcher noted there were 2 groups of trees. Larger oaks and smaller trees were generally non-oaks. And that's kind of what we demonstrated in our demonstration forest, where we still have these large uh, overstory canopy trees uh, dominated by oaks, but there's very little regeneration of oaks in the understory, and there's mostly maple and other mesophytic species kind of in the mid-story and understory. And then this quote from the researcher: pre-fire, ground cover was sparse, comprised mostly of tree seedlings and woody vines, and shade-intolerant herbaceous species were absent. But then following these 3 fires, the tree density decreased by 26%. The basal area actually increased because the mortality was concentrated on the smaller stems. So the larger trees survived, smaller individuals did not. And interestingly, sugar maple was the only tree species found not to decline in density. And so that's why you have a lot of folks recommending that we need to, in addition to bringing fire back to the landscape, we also might need to cut out some of those maples in order to kind of accelerate the process of bringing back fire adapted communities. They also found that woody stems increased 170%. So this was another interesting finding from just 2 different species, blackberry and sassafras. So that's another thing to consider if you have a site that is dominated by some of these species that tend to resprout aggressively. You might want to consider some other management options. Another positive they found, though, was ground cover species richness increased 81% from 42 to 76 species. And then they also found that species diversity nearly tripled in their half-meter plots from 3.2 to 9.4 species. So this is just a small case study. These findings are going to vary widely depending on the type of forest, site characteristics, slope aspect, all sorts of different things. But just wanted to give you an example of a fairly decent study about what can occur with a fire regime in an Illinois forest. So with that, we'll get into some of the wildlife impacts of fire in forests. And this slide is in reference to a study on a cavity-dwelling bat. This is actually about a individual species, the evening bat, and that is not an evening bat pictured on the right. That is actually a red bat, but I'll get to that in a second. So this study found that burn regimes increased suitable roost sites for this evening bat. And the way it did that is that it increased the number of snags, so dead trees standing in the forest where these cavity-dwelling bats, basically, if you're not familiar, they'll oftentimes find old dead trees that have their bark kind of sloughing off, and they'll go up under that bark that's sloughing off, and they'll roost there during the day. So these researchers suggested that it may also reduce predation because the fire regime added roost sites in the interior of the forest, where these roost sites in the interior are less likely to be impacted by predators, um, just because predators a lot of times will use the edges of habitat. They also found that the more open understory of burned areas was beneficial for some species for hunting. So they're more able to fly around in the understory and capture their prey. On the other hand, they also mentioned that, this is one species of one bat that might benefit, but there are other bats that may have issues. Uh, so litter dwelling and bat species that use decaying snags might be negatively impacted by a more aggressive fire regime. And that brings me back to the red bat here on the right. This is actually a bat that came across as we were conducting a burn. And bats, if you're unaware, while they're roosting, um, they go into what's called a torpor. It's basically a deep sleep. They're almost unconscious. Their um, heart rate drops, and it's almost like a hibernation sort of activity. And so it can take some doing to sort of rouse these bats that are resting to get out of the way if there's a fire. So it's believed that this red bat is actually exhibiting signs of torpor. So it could sense that there was a fire and it was able to wake itself up enough to get out of harm's way. And it hasn't fully come out of torpor at this point. So it's still basically kind of stunned, but it was expected that it would recover from that. So kind of an interesting um, uh, species group, and you know, pros and cons for different species is kind of one of the themes that I hope folks get out of this talk. Um, so moving into reptiles and amphibians in forests. Kind of similar to reptiles and amphibians in prairies in some respects. Um, I think there is more opportunities for refugia in forests, at least in forests in southernmost Illinois. There's a lot of diversity um, in uh, in certain burn units where there might be areas that go unburned. Uh, but in terms of a specific case here of the timber rattlesnake, which is one that it is state threatened in Illinois, and it's one that we are concerned about in terms of fire, and for good reason. There was a study in uh, northwest Arkansas, I believe, and they documented a number of different populations and what burns did to some of those was pretty staggering. In one site, they had um, monitored 20 snakes in one burn unit, and only 2 of those were found to have survived a fire that went through a single fire in the spring, right as the snakes were emerging. So they were very vulnerable. They weren't super active at that time. Um, and they tracked this population in this area for years after this fire, and they did find that the site has been repopulated by juvenile migrants from adjacent areas. Um, and they believe, give it enough time, it will recover, but just goes to show you that a single burn timed at the wrong time can have pretty significant impact on certain species. So basically, what we do to combat that in our area is to conduct burns in areas that are known to be habitat for this species prior to their spring emergence. So we have a cutoff date. After that cutoff date, fires are no longer conducted, especially in these areas that were um, habitated by timber rattlers. Um, one other thing I just wanted to mention, I really didn't get into amphibians that much for either of these. Um, some salamanders in particular could be impacted by fire, again, mostly by um, habitat changes. So some species that dwell in leaf litter, for example, uh, with the fire burning up a lot of that leaf litter, could make that an unsuitable habitat for those species, and they'll have to move into another area, an unburned area, in order to survive. Um, moving into birds in forests. So um, this is going to be very similar to grassland birds in a way. The main driver again is going to be the structure of vegetation and adaptations of different birds to different structure. Uh, Forest interior species are probably less likely to prefer a robust fire regime. Uh, More open forest species are going to benefit from more fire. And I did like this quote, the effectiveness of conservation strategies for birds in eastern deciduous forests requires maintaining a mosaic of habitats covering the entire successional range within and across landscapes. So basically, a diversity of habitats is what's going to benefit the most number of birds. And here's some examples of some increasers and decreasers depending on the fire regime. So on the left, you have some pretty typical species that prefer more open habitat types, and on the right, we have species that prefer more closed campy, mature forest. One sort of transitional habitat between grasslands and forests that I wanted to mention. Uh, this Barrens habitats are generally um, sort of grassland areas found in pockets within forested areas. They generally have very thin soils with rocky outcrops, such as the image you see here. Wanted to mention one study where it was found that fires did not significantly reduce woody species or increase the herbaceous component of the study sites during a growing season. And this is kind of the thing that I wanted to mention about the importance of longer term studies that look at several fires over time. So this was looking at one season after a single fire and the impacts of that fire on the site. And then I also had this case study here of interactions between wildlife and vegetation and fire. So it gets even more complicated. So this is a case study of northern blazing star. This is actually a subspecies that does not occur in Illinois, but we have a different subspecies here. But this study looked at and found an increase in flowering plants following fire. They found a greater number of seeds per flower head after a fire. And then, in addition to the greater number of flowers and greater number of seeds, they also found 40 to 50% less predation. So there was a moth that their larvae would feed on the seeds, and within these burn units, they found a lot less of those predators. So just a huge benefit to this individual species with that increase. So kind of an interesting case. And then I did want to mention more about direct mortality of vertebrates. So I did talk a little bit about some instances, but if you look at the literature, there is a lot of discussion, and this quote here kind of sums up a lot of what you might find. Documented direct effects on wildlife are rare. Um, the general consensus is that it is not a major factor. A lot of times we might find burned individuals, such as some of these pictured here, but we, in most cases, don't have solid ideas of what the overall population numbers are before incidents such as that. So it's really difficult to extrapolate. And in a lot of cases, I think that mortality events are probably underreported. I can think of a couple instances myself where people have shied away from admitting certain things. So I think that's something that warrants further study, and I think it'd be good to do more of that. And I did want to also mention too, fire and invasive plants. So this is another talk that we could give. Just want to mention here, there are a number of species, just like any other plants. There are going to be increasers and decreasers, some that appear to be more neutral. You can use fire as an integrated pest management, part of an integrated pest management control strategy. So you might do a fire in concert with an herbicide application, for example. And it all is dependent on timing and intensity of fire and a whole nother suite of factors. So just to close off, fire is super complex and variable. Intensity, timing, and repetition over time may lead to different results. Changes in vegetation structure probably are the most significant impact to wildlife, but we don't want to ignore mortality events. We want to allow for refugia, either don't force fire into areas where there's an unburned portion of a unit. You might divide a site or move portions of sites from burn units in order to provide for that as well. I have this slide on references. I'm not going to leave it up because we're almost out of time, but this will be disseminated later, and if you're interested in learning more. With that, I'll open up to questions. I know we're pretty close to time, but I'll be happy to take a few questions.
Thanks, Kevin. We've already had a lot of questions come in while you were talking, so I'm just going to hit a few of those. One question, somebody asked you to define messification. You mentioned it earlier, but can you define what you're talking about quickly?
Yeah, so messification is kind of the process by which more shade-loving plants take over the dominance of a site over more sun-loving plants. So it's basically that whole idea of oak hickory dominated forests shifting over time to more shade tolerant species. So basically, young maples are able to tolerate more shade. They grow up into the mid-story, and then as the older oaks die off, those maples in the mid-story then become the dominant tree cover, and they suppress oak species from regenerating in the understory. So basically, you've shifted from the dominant trees of these sun-loving oak hickory forests to more shade-tolerant species.
All right, thanks. One question that I really wanted to make sure we get to here. Somebody wrote, how do you find the balance between doing prescribed burns and preventing the deleterious effects on beneficial species, whether that's plants or animals? And they said clearly it's timing, but he wants, the question is, when is the best time? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, it depends. I mean, it is very complicated. So it's very site specific in a lot of cases, and regionally, there are differences. So when I was working in Northern Illinois, we had a lot of smaller sites where if you burned up most of one of those smaller sites, there's no adjacent habitat, sometimes for miles away. So insects and other things couldn't really repopulate those areas. So it was a lot more important in Northern Illinois to burn off kind of smaller portions of some of those habitat areas. Whereas in southernmost Illinois, we have a lot of habitat, and it might be somewhat fragmented, but it's a lot easier for unburned or for critters from unburned areas to repopulate sites that are burned. Even larger burn units that you've seen lately from the Forest Service and other agencies, there's so much adjacent habitat to those burn sites that those sites will be readily repopulated from adjacent lands for anything that was, well, most anything that may have been negatively impacted. So there's really not a generalization that I can give for exactly that, but you have to look at the specifics of the site and adjacent areas and all of these other complicating factors.
All righty, thanks. We had a bunch of questions asking about specific species or specific groups of species and what fire can do. Too many that we can touch upon, but two of them that I think are useful. One is fire's impacts on controlling or impacting poison ivy, and the second one is on ticks.
Yeah. Actually, poison ivy, I am not totally sure how that reacts to fire. If I remember correctly, it can be somewhat controlled by fire. It's a semi-woody species, so it likely resprouts following fire, but the additional benefits to other species in those areas will likely help to suppress that sort of smaller woody stem that you'd have on poison ivy. In terms of ticks, yeah, there is some research out there that suggests that fires can help to reduce the occurrence of ticks. I'm not super familiar with it, but I believe the idea is that um, more or less the fire would control more of the brushy understory that then would reduce deer densities to some extent, and deer being one of the main tick carriers then would consequently reduce the numbers of ticks, if I remember right.
All right, thanks. Again, we have a lot of questions that I think we're unable to get to just due to time restraints, and I'm sure that you wouldn't mind people emailing you. I see your email up on the screen if they want to follow up with their particular question. I think we can end with one question that I like a lot here. Somebody says if they want to have someone come evaluate whether burning would be beneficial to their property, who would they contact? How would they go about that?
Good question. It could be a number of people, depending on where you're at. You could contact your state forester for your region. A lot of times they'd be the ones that could come out and evaluate your property. Um, in Southern Illinois, we have a number of folks here, myself included, and some other groups such as the River to River Cooperative Weed Management Area or Southern Illinois Prescribed Burn Association. If you have private lands in this area, those folks are oftentimes dealing with fire on private lands, and they'd be good people to reach out to. Again, I'd be happy to talk with anyone more about that in the future. Just give me a shout through email, preferably, and I'll be happy to discuss more.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Kevin. I think we'll have to leave it there just for time restraints.
Yeah, sorry, I went a little bit long. Sorry, everybody, but yeah, give me a shout if you have more questions. Appreciate you tuning in.
All right, thanks. And this does conclude our spring webinar series for Extension Forestry. Look for an email from us in the near future with the PDF slide handouts and the recording of this. Thanks, everybody.